In my grandmother's dining room there was a glass-fronted cabinet, and in the cabinet a piece of skin. It was a small piece only, but thick and leathery, with strands of coarse reddish hair. It was stuck to a card with a rusty pin. On the card was some writing in faded black ink, but I was too young then to read. What's that? A piece of brontosaurus. My mother knew the names of two prehistoric animals, the brontosaurus and the mammoth. She knew it was not a mammoth. Mammoths came from Siberia. The brontosaurus, I learned, was an animal that had drowned in the flood, being too big for Noah to ship aboard the ark. I pictured a shaggy, lumbering creature with claws and fangs and a malicious green light in its eyes. Sometimes the brontosaurus would crash through the bedroom wall and wake me from my sleep. This particular brontosaurus had lived in Patagonia, a country in South America, at the far end of the world. Thousands of years before, it had fallen into a glacier, travelled down a mountain in a prison of blue ice, and arrived in perfect condition at the bottom. Here, my grandmother's cousin, Charlie Millward, the sailor, found it. Charlie Millward was captain of a merchant ship that sank at the entrance to the Strait of Magellan. He survived the wreck and settled nearby in Punta Arenas, where he ran a ship repairing yard. The Charlie Millward of my imagination was a god among men, tall, silent, and strong, with black mutton-chop whiskers and fierce blue eyes. He wore his sailor's cap at an angle, and the tops of his sea boots turned down. Directly he saw the brontosaurus poking out of the ice, he knew what to do. He had it jointed, salted, packed in barrels, and shipped to the Natural History Museum in South Kensington. I pictured blood and ice, flesh and salt, gangs of Indian workmen, and lines of barrels along the shore, a work of giants, and all to no purpose. The brontosaurus went rotten on its voyage through the tropics, and arrived in London, a putrefied mess, which was why you saw brontosaurus bones in the museum, but no skin. Fortunately, cousin Charlie had posted a scrap to my grandmother. My grandmother lived in a red brick house set behind a screen of yellow spattered laurels. It had tall chimneys, pointed gables, and a garden of blood-coloured roses. Inside it smelled of church. I do not remember much about my grandmother except her size. I would clamber over her wide bosom, or watch slyly to see if she'd be able to rise from the chair. Above her hung paintings of Dutch burghers, their fat buttery faces nesting in white ruffs. On the mantelpiece were two Japanese homunculi with red and white ivory eyes that popped out on stalks. I would play with these, or with a German articulated monkey, but always I pestered her, "Please, can I have the piece of brontosaurus?" Never in my life have I wanted anything as I wanted that piece of skin. My grandmother said I should have it one day, perhaps, and when she died I said, "Now I can have the piece of brontosaurus," but my mother said, "Oh, that thing, I'm afraid we threw it away." At school they laughed at the story of the brontosaurus. The science master said I mixed it up with a Siberian mammoth. He told the class how Russian scientists had dined off deep frozen mammoth and told me not to tell lies. Besides, he said, brontosauruses were reptiles. They had no hair, but scaly armoured hide. And he showed us an artist's impression of the beast, so different from that of my imagination. Grey-green, with a tiny head and a gigantic switchback of vertebrae, placidly eating weed in a lake. I was ashamed of my hairy brontosaurus, but I knew it was not a mammoth. It took some years to sort the story out. Charlie Millward's animal was not a brontosaurus, but the mylodon, or giant sloth. He never found a whole specimen, or even a whole skeleton, but some skin and bones preserved by the cold, dryness, and salt in a cave on Last Hope Sound in Chilean Patagonia. He sent the collection to England and sold it to the British Museum. This version was less romantic, but had the merit of being true. My interest in Patagonia survived the loss of the skin, for the Cold War woke in me a passion for geography. In the late 1940s, the cannibal of the Kremlin shadowed our lives. You could mistake his moustaches for teeth. We listened to lectures about the war he was planning. We watched the civil defense lecturer ring the cities of Europe to show the zones of total and partial destruction. He saw the zones bump one against the other, leaving no space in between. The instructor wore khaki shorts. His knees were white and knobbly, and we saw it was hopeless. The war was coming, and there was nothing we could do. Next, we read about the Cobalt Bomb, which was worse than the hydrogen bomb, and could smother the planet in an endless chain reaction. I knew the colour of cobalt from my great-aunt's paint box. She had lived on Capri at the time of Maxim Gorky and painted Caprio boys naked. Later, her art became almost entirely religious. She did lots of St. Sebastians, always against the cobalt blue background, always the same beautiful young man, stuck through and through with arrows and still on his feet. So I pictured the Cobalt Bomb as a dense blue cloud bank, spitting tongues of flame at the edges, and I saw myself out alone on a green headland, scanning the horizon for the advance of the cloud. And yet we hoped to survive the blast. We started an emigration committee and made plans to settle in some far corner of the earth. We pored over atlases. We learned the direction of prevailing winds and the likely patterns of fallout. The war would come in the northern hemisphere, so we looked to the southern. We ruled out Pacific Islands for islands are traps. We ruled out Australia and New Zealand, and we fixed on Patagonia as the safest place on Earth. I pictured a low timber house with a shingled roof, caulked against storms, with blazing log fires inside and the walls lined with the best books, somewhere to live when the rest of the world blew up. Then Stalin died, and we sang hymns of praise in chapel. But I continued to hold Patagonia in reserve. Hello there, and welcome to Book Time with Elvis with me, Mark, and welcome back to another edition of Off the Shelf. And this week's pick is, and you probably guessed it, In Patagonia. Oh dear, the sun is so bright. In Patagonia by the late great Bruce Chatwin, who very sadly died long before his time. And this is an absolutely fantastic book about Chatwin's travels in search of that particular monster and all the experiences he has whilst in Patagonia. Let's just read the blurb on the front for you to further entice you into reading this. It's a very short blurb, so don't worry. In Patagonia, beautifully written and full of wonderful descriptions and intriguing tales, In Patagonia is an account of Bruce Chatwin's travels to a remote country in search of a strange beast and his encounters with the people whose fascinating stories delay him on the road. So there we go. Check it out if you get a chance. Can't do anything about that, unfortunately. Yeah, terrible glare, but you can see it. Bruce Chatwin, In Patagonia. Check it out. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Do take care, everybody. Bye for now.